Welcome to the 70th episode of the Hail Married podcast. I'm Atoves, and I'm joined by my husband, the Toves. We're back to recap our dominant win over South Florida. Let's get started. It ended up being a record-breaking senior night at the Alamo Dome. But it didn't start out that way. In the words of our friend Rob, on the opening drive, South Florida cut through us like butter, easily scoring a touchdown to get on the board first. UTSA responded with an 8-play drive, resulting in a 30-yard touchdown pass to Devin McEwen. 2 drives later, South Florida regained the lead on a long touchdown pass. The Roadrunners responded again, this time with a 33-yard touchdown reception by Tyke Ogle-Kellogg. Just when it felt like we were headed to a back-and-forth shootout, the defense forced a 3-and-out, and just 2 plays later, Frank Harris connected with Josh Cephas on a 64-yard touchdown pass, giving the Roadrunners their first lead of the game. UTSA would never trail again, adding 4 rushing touchdowns, 1 from Robert Henry and 3 more from Frank Harris, as they stampeded the Bulls on senior night with a 49-21 victory. In likely his last game at the Alamo Dome, Frank Harris finished with 411 yards passing, 112 yards rushing, and 6 touchdowns. UTSA improves to 8-3 and 7-0 in conference play, setting up a showdown next week in Tulane. What were your thoughts on the game?
Great atmosphere for a senior game, right? There's just the great performances from, I think, plenty of seniors that we'll talk about here when we start breaking down the game a little bit more. Also, there was some kids there at the game. It looks like there was some youth teams that showed up. One in particular, my cousin's son, Sergi, showed up with his Crystal City Javelina high school football team to the game. They have shirts that said "Win the Day." Little take from Coach Traylor.
Yep.
Hope they had fun. Sergi actually ended up being honorable mention all district for Crystal City. He's an offensive lineman, junior offensive lineman. So look forward to seeing him do some great things, I think, senior year. And congratulations to the other Crystal City Javelina all district players. I just wanted to shout out Sergio because, it's Sergi, right? But yeah, just overall, it felt like a good night. And
it was that nice kind of Friday night atmosphere that I think they were looking for. And it was good to see that South Florida traveled well. Again, it wasn't a gigantic group, but given the amount of fans that we've seen from other schools, even ones that are closer in proximity, it was a pretty good crowd from them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we say that because they weren't all necessarily in essentially the visitors portion. There was a nice group there, but they were kind of scattered throughout. Sure. And some of these other fans were also kind of dressed up in gear. There was one that traveled that had chronicled on Twitter like his day in San Antonio wearing a USF jersey and shoulder pads. Yeah,
and going to the theater. And he was there with his flag pretty much all the way to the very end.
Yeah, with his face paint too. And it was just good for him. Those are the type of fans that we need traveling to, the hardcore ones that'll, I don't know if he was from the Texas area or if he is from Florida, but just absolutely wonderful to see him come to San Antonio to cheer on his team and to really just show out for it.
Yeah.
Look, we talked about the fact that this was really a great game, and it was a great game for the seniors, obviously getting a school record, especially on offense, 643 yards. So, as we started kind of looking at the game a little bit more generally, it was just interesting that we got to that number because we started out so slow.
Yeah, it seemed like it was going to be this kind of shootout, so it wasn't completely surprising, but I think the thing that was surprising for me was the defense starting out slow and then really kind of turning it on. We knew that South Florida was going to play with tempo, but it just didn't seem like we were ready for that those first couple of drives. Finally they kind of adjusted to it and got into it. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the defense. But it was just interesting to see that first drive, after all of this discussion about Gush having been at Tennessee and how the play is similar. And then you just kind of saw them run through us just like Tennessee did, although Tennessee's was much more explosive.
Yeah. Absolutely. You're right about the defense having some problems. There were some times where it didn't look like they were aligned. I said, we'll talk about it a little further here, as you said. My question is, do you think that there was adjustments that UTSA made, or was it something else?
Yeah, I think they made adjustments once they realized exactly what that pace was going to mean. I'm sure they had packages and planned transitions, and we still saw them get a little sloppy later on, but I do think they finally kind of woke up and maybe made those little tweaks before it got out of hand.
Yeah, but I disagree. I think it was more just UTSA wearing them down and just winning the matchups.
Sure.
I think we like to give more credit to the coaching staff for making.
Why would we give credit to that?
Big adjustments. But it felt like our guys. I see your little shot there. But I still think it's the players, and I say this because Traylor routinely says is a player's game.
Yeah.
I felt like the players felt like they were starting to win these matchups and overwhelm South Florida, kind of like we had talked about in some of our previews. So, yeah, I don't know that there was a lot because it didn't look schematically at times like there was big things. It was just, like I said, after a while, all of a sudden defensive line starts winning their battles. The offensive line just gets a little bit of extra push on the USF defense, and you start getting a couple of holes here and there. So
all right, I'll give you that. But apparently we're a second half team again. Is that the storyline?
I think, okay, you've called out the team a couple times on certain things, many times just jokingly doing it. But it just seems like now they're just rubbing it into you, going, no, we really are second half team.
Yeah, one thing I thought was interesting, though, since we were talking about that, is that this was the first time that we started from behind in 5 weeks. We have been starting fast, and we've been getting on the board first. So, again, I think it just sort of feeds into that narrative where it felt like, okay, it was sluggish. Again, we scored on our first drive offensively, but we hadn't played from behind in a long time.
Yeah, we were losing in the first quarter. At the end of it, it was 14-7. South Florida, and even though you felt like UTSA was going to come back, it just felt kind of odd. Like, all right, are we going to get in gear? Like, or have the emotions taken over, right?
Exactly.
Okay, well, look, I picked 45 points. You picked 35. UTSA ends up with 49. I feel like we're getting, I kind of pressed you into making some predictions this year along with me. And I feel like you're starting to get a hang of, like, getting those points. Because, I'm just, like, throwing them out there. I'm really just looking at stuff. And particularly, this was just a bad AAC defense. Is really what it comes down to. You knew that Frank could have a good game. I just didn't think it was going to be that, I think, explosive.
Sure.
Obviously, if we're homers, we're going to say that. But for the most part, I think thinking about it a little more objectively, we kind of felt like it's not going to be too big. Okay, couple last thoughts about USF before we move on. Naquan Wright, running back for South Florida. He was a starter right next to Byron Brown, their quarterback. Mm-hmm. They're warming up right in front of the touchdown clubs, where the visitors always warm up at. And as some of these youth teams were kind of going through the back of the end zone to head around the sidelines, and I think really to set up to be right there when the UTSA enters the dome.
Right.
Naquan was really about I think he was at the field goal post, and he was just all of a sudden just started putting out his hand, and he was kind of slapping hands with all the kids that went by. Really cool thing to see because, we were at the touchdown club before the game, and I just kind of want to check out, what USF looked like. But I had never, and we've done this before, we've gone down there, but I had never seen an opponent kind of greet essentially an opponent's fans or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's such a simple thing, but one thing that you have to think about, and he was smart about in this case, is that those are youth kids that are here watching UTSA, but that doesn't mean that they couldn't become a South Florida recruit down the road.
Right.
So maybe because of that gesture, maybe they consider South Florida when they wouldn't have before.
And even further, they become Naquan Wright fans, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they just follow him wherever he goes. And so, cool little story. Just wanted to make sure that was shared within our podcast world. The other thought for USF, they hired the right guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hearing him talk post-game too, there was a feeling that you got that he understood the big picture. Like, yeah, there was some calls that could have gone their way, but he understood they weren't going to win. Yeah. And it wasn't like they weren't going to fight, but he had this team, to me, prepared. Mm-hmm. They just ran out of depth, essentially, is what happened. But, there's other question marks around the AAC, the Poggy. I would look at you right now.
That in a little bit.
Yeah. But to me, USF is in good hands. They're going to be dangerous.
Oh, yeah, they will absolutely be a team that is going to be tough to beat in the future.
Yeah. All right, let's talk offense first. Keys to victory. Grind their defense down with the run. I mean, we had problems with our running backs doing so. They just couldn't really seem to find the holes, and it really felt like South Florida was really focusing on stopping our rushing attack. Frank did rush 10 times for 112 yards, led UTSA in rushing, and he scored 3 touchdowns off those rushes. However, not all of those were essentially runs. Some of them were just scrambles on essentially pass plays that he essentially turned into big runs.
Yeah, it just seemed like, they were ready to defend the run, but they weren't ready for Frank to be healthy enough to scramble like that. I think they were assuming that he was going to play the way that he has these last couple of games where, he really hasn't taken off like that just because he's been injured. And he looked like the Frank of 2022.
Yeah, and I think it was good for this offense because it helped this offense keep from bogging down. And while I always hate the fact that sometimes, Frank gets into a hero ball mode.
Yeah.
I was scared that he would get into that and take either a costly hit or throw, have a couple of costly turnovers that, would kind of ruin the senior night for him. But it didn't happen, which is good.
I mean, on one of the touchdown runs, you could see him reach, like he was just going for the first down, and then all of a sudden he was like, oh, I can spin, and like there's green right in front of me, and he just kind of spun around and just kept running and ended up with a touchdown. Yeah,
and honestly, it was really just, I think, even him, realizing, oh, they're gonna give me room to operate.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So he did. Because offensively, as I mentioned before, 643 total yards. You mentioned, some of his stats. 224 yards rushing overall, 419 passing for this UTSA offense. Just complete domination. Mm-hmm. And again, as I mentioned before, it's not hard to believe because of this USF defense wasn't very good. I mean, they've got players, but we talked about the fact that they just didn't seem to be playing really well as a unit.
Right.
I thought something that was really cool that I had mentioned to you before was the fact that Frank Harris's last touchdown, possibly here in the Dome, was a touchdown run straight at the UTSA student section.
Yeah, it felt very fitting, like it just kind of capped off his career right there.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously we know that he's been here for 7 years, and right. I try not to laugh too much about it because, we know the jokes and everything. However, I mean, these are also kids that probably saw him play early in his career, either as students in high school and then got to join him in college and now kind of brush shoulders, quote unquote, with him as they're going through the UTSA campus. But, it's one thing to like just kind of see the quarterback, but sometimes when you actually get to see him away from the field and kind of see a different side of him, you kind of start rooting for him a little bit harder. And sure. I think that was the case here, and it was, again, like you said, it was a nice bow on this career right there.
Yep, and ended up being the American Offensive Player of the Week. So great accolades for him going into what we'll talk about is going to be a really tough game next week. The other senior, again, that had a really great night was Josh Cephas. He had 9 receptions for 163 yards, one of those being that 64-yard touchdown pass, which put him over the edge of being the school leader in receiving yards at 3,454. And we still have at least 2 more games.
Yeah, he's going to, as Shirley has said before, you can put your name in the record books here because it's such a young program, and it's a really cool thing, I think, for a lot of these players to be able to experience For Josh Cephas, he's had these well-known legal issues.
Right.
They've come up during the season.
Didn't know what kind of a distraction that might have been for him, throughout the season. We talked about that from the very beginning.
Right. But it just looks like, he had just that great moment of the 64-yard touchdown pass, but even, I think, a much better moment in the post-game when, Greg Luca and JJ Perez always do a kind of a recap of the game. Very good. But Greg noted that Josh brought up the fact of his legal issues unprompted.
Right.
And in listening to it, it just felt so genuine, so heartfelt. He understood what the consequences could have been had something major happened. And it's clear he learned his lesson. Whether you believe it or not, I, for one, do, because I don't think that you can stand up there and take the heat for something like that and not learn the lesson and, be the leader that, from what I had seen on the field at times before this incident happened, you can't be that type of leader and just kind of fake it. It just wasn't possible. He's a very genuine guy. A lot of good stories about him. Obviously made a mistake. I'm not going to be here to say, that it was a good or bad mistake. That's his life. However, like you said, it's just a great way to cap off his senior career, along with another senior wide receiver, which is Tyke.
Yeah. Once again, Tyke getting a touchdown. He has scored more games this season than he has any other time in his career, and we obviously needed that with him stepping up to take JT Clark's place. Great to see that he was able to live up to that potential. Fortunately got a little bit banged up on that touchdown, but he was still able to come back and play. Hopefully he'll be healthy for the Tulane game.
Inadvertently, he becomes essentially the third receiving option for Frank this season. Mm-hmm. Devin McEwen goes up and becomes number 2.
Right.
And it was great to see Josh, again, as we talked about before, go from being the third option to the number 1 option. All three of them just went out there and filled the roles and did it at really a high level. And the reason I bring up Devin McEwen here, along with these two seniors, because you made a little observation as we were going through the senior night game.
Yeah, it was kind of like this, passing of the torch to Devin McEwen and David Amador. Like, you just saw the future of what UTSA offense can be next year with those two guys out there. And Devin, I think, was really kind of the spark to get the offense moving in that first drive.
He's been doing that a lot this season. We've talked a lot and gushed a lot about him. But, again, we'll gush about him again. Some fantastic catches. The body control he had at times to make said catches.
Right. They weren't always the best thrown,
Yeah. And it looked like Frank had a little extra juice. It's senior night, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't blame him for that. Like,
right.
He's a little juiced. He's excited. His family's there. He's celebrating with other fellow seniors, guys that he's been, playing on the football field with for a long time. And just good moments. And like you said, David Amador, there was a couple of moments there where you're like, wow, this kid, he can be explosive.
Yeah, he can be very fast. So, a lot to look forward to in the future.
All right, any more for the offense that you want to talk about?
I think that about covers it.
All right, let's get to your special teams area.
Yeah, overall special teams I thought was good. The punting from Lucas Dean was good. It looked more like what we've seen from him in previous years. Probably because he's now more healthy than he's been all season with his 2 broken legs. Poor guy. No field goals, so you can't really judge, based off of that. But, we had a lot of great kickoffs from Tate that, for the most part, weren't returnable. Did get a little bit chippy and got some penalties there on some of our extra point tries. But I think at some point we started to just let things bother us a little bit.
Yeah.
It has happened from time to time on special teams.
So it's good that it just didn't get really out of hand, because there were moments where I thought this was getting, all of a sudden, USF could get a little clumsy and potentially, cause some injuries for either USF or them or us. So it's good that the refs kind of grabbed control back, because even for South Florida, you don't want to see them taking any big injuries into their last game against Charlotte, especially because I really want them to beat Charlotte, but that's a different reason. We'll talk about that later. Okay, let's go on to the defense. Keys for the defense: get pressure on Byron Brown. I think they were successful in getting to Brown. They got 7 hurries, only got 1 sack, but with that pressure on Byram, they essentially caused 2 interceptions.
Right.
And they were critical because the first one, they were trying to convert a 4th down. And on the second one, again, I believe it was also another 4th down, but they were trying to put the ball in the end zone. And we'll get to that second one here in a little bit. But the first one really stuck out to you because of a particular player.
Yeah, I mean, it was DeJuan Griffin who managed to catch that interception with the club on his hand. And, that's a really tricky. I mean, we've seen, I think...
Tariq had it, and that's what I was going to ask you. What is it about our cornerbacks and having just, injured appendages here?
Yeah, but, again, good to see DeJuan step up on senior night. He did not participate in this senior night because he has said that he's going to come back for his super senior season. So, again, still good, though, to see a great play from him. Pretty impressive, again, because he had the club in his hand. And we didn't see any reckless penalties from him this game, which was
But nice. The awareness to go out of bounds instead of looking for a lot of extra yards on the interception.
Because it was hard for him to...
It was, but, again, I think you feel like with a little chippy guy like him, that he was going to try to do a little bit too much.
Right.
But it really was good to see him just go out of bounds and say, look, I'll live to fight another day. I got the interception. That's all that matters.
Right.
We now have possession of the ball. So good for them there. I just think that Byron Brown for USF, while he had some success, I think that whether it was the reads or some of the other issues he had, he could have turned the corner on some of these essentially read option plays that they had, but he kept handing it off to Naquan. And Naquan had some, success, but I feel like they could have had a little more success had Byram really tucked it and run around the edge on us.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what he did on the 1 touchdown that he scored. I think, again, it's just the difference in him being a redshirt freshman. Will we see him make different decisions in the next couple of years? I think so.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, defense gives up 427 total yards, 101 in the 4th quarter. We can agree that was pretty much trash time, right?
The game was over at that point,
They made stops on 10 of 13 drives. We can routinely see this now from the UTSA defense, really just handling some of these offenses. Look, we knew that, as we had talked about before, that USF was going to play with the tempo. And to me, the substitution plans were a little flawed at times because there were some moments where USF hadn't substituted yet. We thought that we could try to trot out an entire team out there.
Yeah, and we're lucky that we had a timeout to use in those scenarios because it could have ended up in a penalty, which might have given some momentum back to South Florida.
Worst of all, it could have resulted potentially in a free play that gets a touchdown, right? And now momentum's even much more in USF's I think side. So look, we've talked about it before. It's happened before with this UTSA defense. I think looking forward right now to Tulane, tempo is not going to be a problem.
Right.
Tulane ranks pretty low in terms of how long it takes for them to snap the ball. So I think that helps UTSA in that matchup. But that's one of the fewer things that it helps in that matchup.
Right.
Look, overall, there was a good play from the defensive line that kind of overwhelmed this USF offensive line. We kind of talked about the fact that started winning matchups.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like after a rough game with Rice, Brandon Brown really had a great game against USF. I felt like Joe Evans, I think he went down during the game, but I thought his presence during the snaps that he did play felt him once again. This defensive line just, and I know I'm gushing about them some more, but it's just really been a great strength for this team overall. There's a lot of good leaders there, and there's just a lot of good players that have sacrificed, I think, stats to really make impacts during their time of play there.
Right.
Jamal Ligon continues to surge at the end of the season, I think just because he likes the fact that you called him out.
Yeah, I mean...
Jokingly, I will say.
Right. He was pretty quiet at the beginning of the season, and, it just seems like these last couple of games where he's played like we've seen him play in previous years. So I don't know if maybe he had some kind of injury or something else was going on at the beginning of the season that maybe we just didn't know about, but he certainly seems to have turned it on, along with Owen Pee-wee. I mean, I think he's been very impressive over the last couple of games. He had 7 tackles and 1 tackle for loss in this game.
Owen stepping up. I mean, now you start seeing a lot of the depth that UTSA has because Owen comes in for Danye.
Right.
And Danye, just causing havoc off the edge. But both these players, just a nice little complement of each other. We kind of talked about it before. But certainly just good to see these guys, especially some of the younger guys that, came on either last season, now making an impact for UTSA this season.
I mean, we could be talking about Owen on offense and Owen on defense next season a lot.
Wow. A little look to the future, right?
Right.
All right. Let's talk real quick about that second interception that they had because it came because you jokingly called out Nick Troy for
it's exactly what happened. Nick Troy stepped up his game because he listened to the podcast.
Yeah.
It was interesting because we were in the touchdown club at that time and standing kind of, behind Nick Troy. So it just looked like the ball was thrown from that vantage point. Like it was thrown right to Nick Troy. And so it was pretty cool. I mean, as soon as I saw the ball getting closer, I was like, he's going to intercept it. It was right there. And of course he did. Good to see him have that kind of night on senior night since he is out of eligibility this year.
Before we end this part of the segment, anybody else you want to call out? That way, that way they can be motivated for the big game against Tulane.
I mean, I feel like Trey Moore was a little quiet in this game.
Oh, wow.
So
you're really going for Trey.
We're going to need him against Tulane, so whatever it takes to motivate him. Maybe another Elliott Davidson interception. I mean, haven't heard his name in a while.
Here we go. All right.
Anybody else you want me to throw out there?
Cam Alexander, why not?
All right, yeah. I mean, he did fall down on one of those...
oh, wow. Now you're throwing a little dirt on him.
Yeah, one of those passes. But it's fine. It's fine.
All right. Just a great overall night for UTSA. All 3 phases of the game. You ready to move on?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, before we get started with the Tulane preview, let's go over some of these AAC championship scenarios so that UTSA fans, whether they know it or maybe they just need a refresher, know exactly what to expect.
Yep.
There's 4 scenarios, essentially, for UTSA, SMU, and Tulane to make this championship game, along with hosting to be decided within these games. It really is sort of a semifinal for UTSA and Tulane, and SMU, I guess you could say they're playing a semifinal in order for them to have a berth in the championship game. Mm-hmm. So I know they're playing Navy, but still, it kind of interesting the way it's worked out. Simply put, UTSA wins and they're in.
Right.
Things, in terms of hosting or whatever, that's going to be determined by the SMU Navy game. But as long as they win, then we have an opportunity to cheer them on for their 3rd consecutive conference championship. So, if SMU beats Navy, then SMU hosts UTSA at 3 o'clock Saturday, ABC. It's just made for, again, being on a 3-letter network.
Yep.
A week later. It would be fantastic. What's more fantastic? If Navy upsets SMU, UTSA hosts Tulane at 3 o'clock on ABC in the Dome. Yeah, it's a lot of exciting things that I think that you can think of as soon as you start looking at, there's pretty much a 50% chance that UTSA can make this championship game. Tulane and SMU have a 75% chance because there's ways they can sneak in. As I just kind of said, SMU loses, Tulane gets a berth in there. So, yeah, it's kind of fun, but also, I like it this way because UTSA has an opportunity to determine their own destiny. So, okay, let's get into the Tulane preview.
Okay.
1-0 all-time versus Tulane. A 10-7 win in 2013 at the Dome. We just barely remember that game.
Yeah. I mean, it was spent 10 years ago, and what I remember about the game is that it was very close, but I couldn't have told you exactly what the score was or how we won the game until, I just went back and watched the highlights recently. But I think you remember it for a different reason.
Yeah, one of our friends was in our section, 135, was snapping pictures of Joe Montana, who's in section 134, where we now sit. And he was like, yep, he's here. Why do I say that? Because Joe Montana's son, Nick, was the starting quarterback for Tulane back in 2013. Yeah, it was, I don't remember the game, too, because Tulane was only in the CUSA for that one season with UTSA.
Right.
After that, it was kind of like, oh, okay, nice to know you. And they went on to the American. So, it was really something, I don't know. It was a nice moment at the time. But, yeah, it was, you're 3 years old as a program. And you're just like, hey, it's kind of cool that you have Joe Montana showing up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So for this game, UTSA opens up as a 4-point underdog to Tulane. Haven't seen where the line has moved to this point, but now Tulane though this season, while undefeated just like UTSA in conference play at 7-0, you made a sort of an interesting insight that you caught as you were reviewing Tulane.
Yeah, they've only won one conference game by more than 14 points, and that was the game last week against FAU, which they won by 16.
Kind of reminds you a little bit of like UTSA back in CUSA play, right? Like
last year, yeah. All these tight contests, yeah.
Right, and Traylor kept telling us over and over, we're playing all these tight contests, but it's hard to win games. It's hard to do that. This season has been kind of a little different. UTSA has looked more dominant. They've been winning by at least 14 or more in many of these games. So, yeah, kind of a nice growth that you can say for UTSA. Mm-hmm. Interesting, though, for Tulane. You had kind of talked about the fact that, it was interesting that they were still ranked after some of these close wins.
Yeah, I get they're 10-1, and I think a lot of their ranking really goes back to what they accomplished last year, maybe more so than what they've accomplished this year. Again, the one loss came to Ole Miss. Michael Pratt was out injured. They still played well in that game, but again, you have so many close contests that I'm surprised that they have continued to be rewarded with a ranking in the top 25.
And a lot of it, I think, is that, some of these voters just look at the record. Yeah. They don't really care about, like, okay, so you only beat this team by this.
Right.
It's when they start kind of getting picky, and I think in the College Football Playoff Committee, that's when they start kind of getting picky. But, UTSA is not even close to that. So let's get to reviewing Tulane overall. Let's start with the offense. In AAC play, they put up 401.1 yards per game. That's 7th in the AAC. And they scored 27.4 points per game, which is 8th in the AAC. This offense is, to me, kind of methodical. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of it is the fact that they've really leaned on the ground game and then just some stellar play by their quarterback.
Yeah, and when you look at the key players, this really comes down to their quarterback. Michael Pratt is a junior. He has 68% completion rate for 2,043 yards passing, 19 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. He's also their second highest rusher, which his stats for rushing aren't that significant, 271 yards, but still he can rush and he can be elusive, which is something that we're just going to have to account for.
Again, look back at UTSA last year, right? Yeah. And you kind of have those comparisons to Frank, right? Where, Frank was the second leading rusher. You talked about it plenty of times throughout this season about how, a quarterback being the second leading rusher on the team.
Yeah, and I would expect he probably would have had more yards had it not been for all of the knee injuries that he's faced.
Yeah.
Even as recently as the game with FAU, he didn't practice most of that week going into the game, very similar to situations we've, can relate to with Frank Harris. But when you talk about the rushing game, it's Mekhi Hughes. He is their leading rusher. He's their workhorse, kind of like Sincere used to be for us. 206 carries for 1,080 yards, 5.2 average, 6 touchdowns. Their other prolific rusher, Clayton Johnson, has been out with injury. So it's really kind of relied on Mekhi Hughes to be the one that's really kind of taking the load this year.
And last year they had Tajay Spears, who has now gone on to the Tennessee Titans. But, they had sort of workhorse, and they really felt... A lot of people like to just kind of diss Tulane for, Michael Pratt just being sort of like a game manager. But you kind of felt the same way to me, like with Frank Harris early in his career, early in the trailer era career, where he just kind of handed off to Sincere, made some good, decent reads, and just made sure to get the ball into the wide receiver's hands. Right. That's really what I think Michael Pratt has done. But they've done it, honestly, I think at a very high level, which, it's shown in some of these games that they've won.
Yeah, they've had a lot of injuries as well on wide receiver. I'll go ahead and mention their leading wide receiver, although he is hurt and questionable. I think it's unlikely that you'll see him in the game, but his name is Lawrence Keys III. He's a senior, 33 receptions for 599 yards, 7 touchdowns. It's an 18.2 average. More than likely, though, you're going to see their second leading wide receiver, Chris Brazzell. He's a redshirt freshman. He has 36 receptions for 577 yards and 3 touchdowns, 16-yard average. So that kind of tells you a little bit right there about when they're choosing to go for their wide receivers. Yeah. These are typically deeper passes. Their O-line has only allowed 9 sacks on Pratt during the AAC play. They've had a lot of injuries here. They've shifted guys around quite a bit. Again, very much like you would hear from UTSA, where they've moved somebody from left guard to left tackle or vice versa, really kind of trying to get to the right grouping based on their injuries and the depth that they have, but they've been pretty consistent regardless of those injuries.
Yeah, I think if you're a Tulane fan, I'm sure you've been looking at your offensive line and going, when are we going to have some consistency? And like you mentioned, it harkens back to UTSA, but from what I saw the last couple weeks, it seems like they're starting to get back to health. And also, to reiterate what you said, it's just they've still been effective, and that's incredible. I mean, UTSA has had those moments as well, but it always felt like we were one injury away from some sort of catastrophe that could cost Frank Harris. So not knowing that much about Tulane's offense or the fans, I'm sure they probably felt like that at some point too, especially with Pratt suffering having that knee issue. All right, let's go to the defense. There's going to be a familiar name here for some. Their defensive coordinator that they hired for the season is named Sheil Wood. He was the defensive coordinator for Troy, the team we played in the Cure Bowl last December.
Hence probably one of the reasons why a lot of these games have been kind of defensive slugfest more than an offensive showcase.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to make the point to you that I felt like there was a lot of Troy to this team. And even before Sheil Wood was here, they started getting very good defensively, but they were so efficient on offense that it's just such a really good combo. So, yeah, I mean, Sheil Wood has really kind of slowed down UTSA's explosive offense in the Cure Bowl. We remember that. I mean, obviously, I understand there were all these injuries for UTSA, but what it really came down to was Troy's defense played a physical, great game that, I imagine that Sheil Wood is going to have a similar game plan for this game.
Well, I was going to say, I think the other thing is this gives them an advantage. While we haven't faced Tulane in 10 years, we have faced their defensive coordinator. So I'm sure he is feeling much more confident about his game plan because of that.
That's a great point. I was going to say Justin Burke versus Sheil Wood 2, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's the rematch. Let's see, let's see what Justin can do. All right, here's some numbers for you on the defense. In AAC play, they give up 342.6 yards per game, which is 4th in the AAC. And they allow 20 points per game, which is 4th in the AAC. A lot of consistency right there. And again, really, I circled this a little bit because it's reminiscent of how Troy was going into the Cure Bowl last season. Look, they allow the fewest rushing yards in the AAC at 86.3 yards per game. That's big because that's exactly what Troy did last season against UTSA in the Cure Bowl. They are 10th in pass defense at 256.3 yards per game. But guess who's 11th? UTSA. Yeah. Their stop rate is about the same as UTSA. Last season, again, Troy had about the similar stop rate, slightly better than UTSA. But the picture I'm trying to paint here is that Shieldwood is a very good defensive coordinator. There's a reason why he made the jump from Sunbelt to the AAC. I'm sure you'll start hearing his name at some point, taking over a program because he's just a talented guy. Let's get to some of the key players here on defense.
Yeah, their leader in total tackles and solo tackles is Jesus Machado. He's a linebacker, a senior. Darius Hodges is the defensive lineman who's a junior and leads their team in sacks at 7.5.
Yeah, it's it always just seems like they have just a good defensive line and then a strong linebacking core. It's typical Shieldwood's defense, as I've kind of been harping on this before. Also, junior linebacker Tyler Grubbs on the team.
Yeah, I think you might remember that name if you're a UTSA fan. And we call him out specifically, not necessarily because he's super high in stats, but just because he has played UTSA a number of years. He transferred from Louisiana Tech. So I think a lot of our fans will probably remember him in some of his plays.
Yeah, and again, more experience to play against UTSA offense, right? Let's go to the special teams.
Their kicker, Valentino Ambrosio, is a senior. He's got a 75% field goal rate. He's consistent. The issue with him is that his long is only 45 yards. So, again, I don't think you're going to see Tulane in situations where it would be over 45 yards going for a field goal. Likely they're going to go for it or punt, depending on the situation there. Okay. Their punter, on the other hand, Will Carroll, has a 61-yard punt for a long. He averages about 44 yards, so pretty consistent as well.
Yeah. All right. On offense for UTSA, key number 1, win the money downs, which are third and fourth down. Tulane's defense is fifth on allowing third down conversions in the AAC at 37.2% and first on allowing fourth down conversions at 27.8%. They do not let you convert. UTSA, at times doesn't get to third down because sometimes how explosive their offense can be. Mm-hmm. But we would be silly to think that UTSA is going to continually, on first and second down, win this game and just beat down this Tulane defense. You're going to get to third and fourth down. And if you remember the Cure Bowl, Troy defense really won the day on UTSA on those money downs. The second key here is finish in the red zone. Tulane is tied for last in allowing scores in the red zone at 90.9%. You get in the red zone on Tulane, you're scoring. What it comes down here is Justin Burke and Frank Harris have to convert once they get there. Mm-hmm. One of the big issues in the Cure Bowl was the fact that UTSA was not converting in the red zone. Right. And because of it, it cost them the game. I mean, we've agonized over that game, but the reason I keep bringing it up is because, again, Shieldwood's here, I think has a good memory of what he can do to slow down Frank Harris. All right, on defense, I really have one big key to victory, and that is win the turnover battle. This UTSA defense has been on a run of getting turnovers, and they need to continue it. And this will really help the UTSA offense, especially help to maybe put up some points or at least get some time off the clock. No team does well when they lose the turnover battle, but I think especially with Tulane, as good as they are, the more pressure you put on them, the more uncomfortable you make them, better chance of winning. So, all right, let's get to our predictions. You want to go first or do you want me to go first?
Sure, I'll go.
All right.
This is going to be the biggest test of the season for the Roadrunners. We have never beaten a ranked opponent. Unlike the Roadrunners, Tulane has played most of their conference opponents in close games, as we mentioned, but that doesn't mean they're the weaker opponent. UTSA needs to start strong, and they need to have their best game of the season on all three phases of the triangle. There are no room for errors in this game. The team knows that. They know it's at stake, and I expect them to rise to the occasion. But it's going to be a close game. Give me UTSA 30, Tulane 27.
Wow. All right. Coach Traylor has had plenty of distractions heading into this game, but I doubt it's affected the players. And I'm saying that because I believe him when he says the players have been here before. There's probably been things that have distracted trailer in the past, yet they still got through it. And this is a veteran UTSA team. This is an opportunity to not only clinch a spot in the AAC championship game, but to beat, as you said, a ranked team for the first time in school history. Preseason, we believed that this would be a big game, and it's living up to that and more. My big question for UTSA is, are you more desperate than Tulane? Everything in my heart tells me to bet on UTSA, but I can't get past the numbers screaming facts back at me. The 7-game winning streak has come against opponents with a combined record of 27-50, and none of those teams have a winning record. UTSA has been outscored by 8.5 points in the trailer era when playing teams with double-digit win totals. Tulane is 10-1. I'll be there cheering for this season to continue next week, but here's a receipt for the team. Give me Tulane 27-24 over UTSA.
Ooh. Before we go, let's talk about a couple of the other games that happened in the American this past weekend.
All right.
SMU beat Memphis 38-34. Was really hoping that Memphis was going to come through for us. They played it pretty close, but it seemed like Seth Hennigan was hurt in that game. He did have to leave at one point, came back, and just didn't seem like Memphis had it all together.
There's a reason why you have SMU, Tulane, and UTSA at the very top, and then there's a gap, and then there's Memphis. Memphis fans will tell you that's crazy, but it's true. Like, they're just not very good situationally, and the top three are.
Yeah.
It's what it really comes down to, and it showed. I know it's 38-34, but honestly, SMU had it much more in hand than this.
Rice beat Charlotte 28-7. They're one game away from being bowl eligible. They could get bowl eligibility next week when they play FAU, which, now that FAU's on a downward slide, looks more likely that Rice might be able to win that. But I think really the story of this game is the comments that Bill Poggi made after.
Well, I found
Biff Poggi, sorry.
Actually, I found out today that his name is Biff Poggi.
Oh.
Had no clue. I know we've been saying it wrong the whole time.
All right, Biff Poggi.
The big thing that I learned today, right? I saw this article, and it's kind of interesting because it talked about the comments, and it talked about the athletic director. The athletic director said how much he's in on Biff.
Oof.
Which, okay, that's fine. You're saying that after the first season. But the comments that Biff makes, I mean, yes, they're a very tell it like it is. But this is where Biff has to understand that that's his responsibility. At the beginning of the season, he said this was a great young coaching staff. By the end of the season, he doesn't think like his coaching staff is very good.
Yeah, and that a lot of them are going to have to go.
Yeah, same thing with a lot of his players. He mentioned some of the recruiting mistakes that he felt that he and the coaching staff made. I was like, what did you think? I mean, you were Jim Harbaugh's right-hand man, and you didn't think that there was going to be sort of this difference between just getting talented players and then finding good chemistry. It really shouldn't have been this big reclamation project, but Biff being Biff, I don't know. I think he'll find a way to kind of slug through some games and kind of somewhat be competitive, but I feel like the future isn't as bright as Biff would have you think. And Biff, this is why nobody at the AAC meetings in the summer wanted to ask you any questions, because they knew that your team was going to be awful based on what they saw.
Yeah, and you're going to lose your locker room for the last game of the season. So, you know what? I feel like you just handed South Florida bowl eligibility right there, because they're going to come in, and we saw how they played against UTSA in the first half. They're talented, not as talented as UTSA, but they're certainly more talented than Charlotte, and those guys are going to be dialed in and focused. Meanwhile, the Charlotte players are going to feel defeated and unhappy and disjointed, and it could be a bloodbath there.
I hope so, because I really want to see some success for Alex Golish and his squad, as I had said back in the recap. I want them to just throttle Charlotte and go into a bowl game to get those extra practices. I mean, they're going to be better, but, still.
And frankly, the American needs some more bowl-eligible teams.
Absolutely.
Right now, it's just those top 4 teams that are bowl-eligible.
Yeah.
Navy beat ECU 10-7. They have 2 more shots to get bowl eligibility. One comes against SMU. The other comes against Army the last week of the season. There's obviously a chance there that they could beat Army. SMU, unlikely, but again, it would be nice if Rice, South Florida, and Navy all came away with wins.
Absolutely.
As much as it wouldn't look good for UTSA to have Army take one more loss. But.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter at this point, but East Carolina, little note there, fired their offensive coordinator. A little too late. We thought that there had been a change when East Carolina played UTSA, but it really wasn't, I guess, what had happened. But you should have made the change around that point anyway.
All right, let's talk about UTSA volleyball. Unfortunately, they lost to UAB 1-3. They have their last game of the season against East Carolina on Wednesday at noon in the Convo. So if you're in town and you're available, go out and support the ladies. Otherwise, they will be on ESPN Plus as well.
It's the day before Thanksgiving, so at the very least, even if you're pretending to be working like I will be, just turn it on ESPN Plus and watch our ladies in their last game of the season. All right, let's get to some UTSA soccer news. Sasha Dade, who's essentially the left back on the UTSA soccer team, is representing Samoa on their women's soccer team during the Pacific Games. Sasha joins Sophie Morin as a second player on the 2023 squad to play on a national team squad. Really cool to see them both get an opportunity to get called up.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Sophie Morin, I think, was it was under 21s. Sasha Dade is actually, like I said, this is the national team. So I understand maybe they're not the biggest countries and the most soccer notorious ones, but this is just really good for UTSA soccer just in general. I mean, you've got 2 players that are on a national team, and according to Sasha, getting some new fans in Samoa. So that's really cool. Samoa beat Tahiti 3-2, and Sasha scored the first goal in the match as well as the first one in her Samoan career. Really cool to have learned that fact. And she's been kind of active on her Instagram, kind of doing a little diary of her time in the Pacific Games. So if you get a chance, I hate to say go check it out and stalk her, but she's got some really cool videos of some of the things that they've been doing, kind of marching into a stadium. It's in the Solomon Islands, so just a cool experience overall and cool to see. Sasha's next game for Samoa is actually 11/24, same day as the Tulane game, but it's at 12 o'clock. Samoa faces Tonga, and they're going to be trying to get into the knockout rounds. So 2.5 hours before the Tulane game, I'm sure UTSA would try to find a link to it, but there are a couple links. They're just a little hard to find, obviously, because the Pacific Games aren't really widely broadcast.
Yeah, widely broadcast in Texas or Louisiana. Yeah. I'm sure probably not. All right, let's talk a little bit about UTSA basketball. Start with the men's team. Unfortunately, they're on a bit of a losing stretch, or they were on a bit of a losing stretch. They lost to Texas State 62-72. It was their lowest shooting percentage of the season at 31%, but they did have great free throw shooting at 72.7%. They just really were struggling on offensive rebounds, allowing turnovers. They kind of started from behind and just struggled to get kind of caught up.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same old story in terms of the turnovers. Just, again, you blew up the team, but it doesn't seem like they've really got a feel of where everybody's going to be. And then, the offense really isn't geared towards, I think, to maximize these players. So right. It's going to be rough.
However, they did, in the words of the ESPN commentator, steal a victory from the jaws of defeat against Houston Christian, 89-87. Had a big win, or a big lead in that game, and kind of let it whittle away right at the very end. Houston Christian had an opportunity to tie the game the very last second and didn't get it. we're lucky that they were able to pull out that victory, but hopefully that gives them a little bit of momentum going into the weekend. They were shooting 49%. This game, so in the previous game with Texas State, Christian Tucker was the leading scorer, but in this game, Dre Fuller had a big night, and he was the leading scorer at 24 points. Christian Tucker was also in double digits.
Yeah, I mean, it was rough. I mean, you could see it coming. The team just started struggling, having to really maintain themselves. And again, kind of like we talked about with football, it's just situational stuff. Like, they just didn't handle it well. Near the end of the game, they were letting the clock come down, and one of the analysts had even said they're going to do a screen, they're going to drive to the basket, but Christian Tucker actually went the other way from the screen and flipped it out for a 3-point attempt. That's so UTSA. It's just not a good choice, and he played exactly what Houston Christian wanted.
Next up for the men is the Roadrunner Classic at the Convocation Center this weekend. They're playing Friday at noon against Jacksonville State and Saturday at 3 p.m. against UIW. Both games are on ESPN+, so if you're traveling to the football game, you'll have a couple of hours to watch them before the football game on Friday. Definitely need your support.
Yeah.
On the women's side, little different story. Seems like these ladies, again, are kind of figuring out how to win without Jordan Jenkins in the lineup. They snuck out a win in overtime against A&M Corpus Christi, 66-59. They recovered from a 15-point deficit at one point in that game.
They started off rough. They just weren't handling the defense and executing on offense, and it just wasn't a very good combination. A&M Corpus Christi has a couple of nice guards that play, I think, on the Spanish national team, or at least one of the Spanish national teams. And they did a very good job of really bothering this UTSA backcourt. But they got it together. But let's also be fair to UTSA. A&M Corpus Christi could have put them away. However, they could not hit free throws. Even at the very end of the game, there was a foul call with really no time left, and A&M Corpus Christi went up and missed those 2 free throws, which sent it into overtime. And from there, UTSA just shut the door. Again, just a very good performance by the women to come back on A&M Corpus Christi.
They also won at UT Arlington, 70-66. It was a career high game for Sydney Love, 26 points, and Maya Linton had a double-double, 15 points, 10 rebounds.
Nice homecoming for Maya Linton, who's from Duncanville. Great to see her come up. She was really holding it down for this UTSA team early on. And then Sydney happened. Sydney just showed up and started playing really well. Idara Udo, freshman, also played well, as did freshman Asia Proctor. Idara Udo, also from the DFW area. I'm sure I'm missing some other players from the DFW area, but still, good to see them really take advantage of this. Sydney Love really got into this just attacking mentality, and that's really what helped to propel this UTSA team forward in this game.
Yeah, and then unfortunately they lost a hard-fought battle against Texas Tech, 58-63. They were shooting 45%, but the turnovers were just a killer in this game.
Yeah, in the first half, they just had so many problems handling the Texas Tech pressure. It really bothered them, and it just, at the very end, I didn't think it was a terrible pass from Sienna to Kira, but Kira just didn't handle it well. And as the commentator said, so fitting that this team has 31 turnovers, and the way they end the game was with the turnover.
Yeah.
They really, though, played very, very well at times and really pushed this Texas Tech team, especially in the third quarter when, unfortunately, they missed like 4 straight free throws that could have closed the gap to about 2 points. But then Tech hit a 3-pointer, and it just extended everything. Essentially started an 8-point lead going into the fourth quarter, and just too much to handle. I mean, Idara Udo got her 4th foul late in the third quarter, and Idara Udo was really dominating the paint and just really putting some pressure on this Texas Tech team. And just a little frustrating because Here is essentially a quote-unquote P5 team, if you look at it from a football perspective, and it's just a chance to have put themselves a chance to win away from the convo. Right. Just already big things from this women's team. I think they're going to continue. They continue to get better, especially without Jordan Jenkins. You know, I've kind of talked about it before, and I think it really rings true. They're just doing some. They're really finding answers to a lot of questions, and it's really cool.
Well, next up for them is Saturday against Sam Houston State in Huntsville at 4 p.m. That game will also be on ESPN+.
Cool.
All right, well, I think that about wraps it up for us. Thanks for joining us on the Hail Mary podcast. I'm A. Toves.
And I'm the Toves.
We'll be back to recap our game against Tulane. I think it'll be a win, though.
Okay, all right. All right, birds up.